And our speakers today are, on the extreme left, as always, Angela Kelly.
I'm proud of it.
Angela Kelly, photographer, teacher, and curator, who is currently Professor of Imaging Arts and Photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology in upstate New York. And we're really pleased to welcome some of her students here today. Simon Roberts, a photographer and honorary fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, who has taught at the University of Nottingham and the European Institute of Design in Madrid, and served as the official British election artist during the 2010 general election. And Ahaiwe Sowinski, artist, photographer, freelance archivist, and community activist, who is currently working on a number of archival projects and collaborations in London, about which we'll hear more in just a moment. So we have given our speakers a very difficult challenge of focusing their presentations on just a few telling examples of their practice, not as representative of a particular stance or position, but as a way into their individual projects and individual engagements. So after hearing from each of our speakers in turn, we're then going to try to move to a more open conversation between them about the commonalities and differences that they see in their practices. But even so, if we stay on course, we still want to have time for comments and questions from the audience. So our time is short, our program is packed, but Angela, would you like to kick us off?
Oh, thanks so much, John. Thanks for inviting me and the Yale Center and Martina. Thank you so much. Let's get cracking over here. So I've given my mini presentation a title. I like titles. And the title is Neither Here Nor There. And I'm talking a little bit about this project I did in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and it's called Catharsis, Images of Post-Conflict Belfast. So Catharsis is partly the story about the impossibility of return, the story of an immigrant who, in the light of rising and anti-immigrant rhetoric in the US and abroad, and inspired by the audacity of hope, became an American citizen in 2008. As an immigrant to the US, I find myself dreaming of one place while I exist in another. The feeling of neither here nor there, of being in between cultures, gives resonance to my particular mode of working. My return to Belfast in 2008 came after a long hiatus. My parents were long gone, a premature result of an accidental fire in our Belfast home in 1998. First reported on the BBC as a possible act of terrorism. This terrible event led me to create two other bodies of work, Domestic Discomfort, which re-examined the family album in the light of trauma, and Sundays at Sea, which focuses on my relationship with my father, a British merchant naval officer. One of the only relics to survive the fire was my father's sea chest, which held family photographs and other mementos. But there was little to return to in that visit, but my curiosity drove me to witness the aftermath of the Good Friday Accord. This work I'm showing also marks a self-aware return to the idea of employing the documentary image. After years of making image text pieces using strategy of collage with scanned imagery. How then could I retrieve a sense of history, memory, and personal identity in a place that was rapidly reinventing itself as the new Belfast, as part of the new Europe then, not so much now, against the roar of the Celtic tiger from across the border? The ideal of a post-conflict site was a tempting subject, but I questioned if the conventional documentary image by itself was sufficient to engage such complexity. In the end, the work was about much more than that. And with a grasp of how fragile the peace process really was, I adopted the stance of the flaneur and walked along one of the main peace lines, a 30-foot plus high corrugated iron and brick wall, which separates loyalists to the Crown from their nationalist neighbours who favour the Republic of Ireland. All the photographs in this series were made specifically on the loyalist or Protestant side of the wall. I asserted myself into a neighbourhood, the no-go land of my childhood, which I had first considered too risky to venture into in a past life, in order to reclaim a space where I could for the first time be present rather than absent. In a sense, I was reinventing myself beyond my newly acquired hyphenated Americanism with Irish roots, so to tentatively claiming a sense of belonging with a new ideal of a post-conflict. As an artist, I was looking for a nuanced visual language with which to critically engage my new sense of authenticity to address the post-conflict aftermath. Each piece in the series presents a number of dualities. There is the trope of the private, intimate album image taken by my father, the British merchant naval officer, versus the very public form of the street photograph made by me, with neighbourhoods divided by mistrust along a loyalist-nationalist divide. In this era of post-conflict, the former so-called troubled sites are reinvented as tourist sites. So in the image you see up here, it's an image of a 12th of July sectarian bonfire site. We see a small hut built by local teens who have amassed a collection of bonfire material. They take turns keeping watch overnight to prevent rival gangs from stealing their loot. In some odd way, the hut recalls my grandfather's time as a night watchman after he retired from the docks. This photograph references a sectarian event, the annual celebration of the 1690 Battle of the Boyne victory by William of Orange over King James II of England. It is a ritual that is also a cautionary tale, one that would seem to have little future in a society set on a peaceful course, yet continues to inspire restless youth whose identities have been shaped by claiming dominion over their neighbours. In the background of this photograph, the stately towers of St. Peter's Catholic Cathedral loom. The antagonistic neighbours are so close in proximity but miles away in ideology. In the foreground, a tire burns as a warning, and the Union Jack, a symbol of loyalist allegiance to the Crown, waves over this small, hastily built hut, foreground in the 12th celebration yet to come. In the margins, two small children stare out from within an album as a reminder of our annual July escape to the country refuge of our great-grandfather's farm. Each image in this series is marked by its GPS coordinates, a familiar trope in today's digital world. However, when I began this work in 2008, cameras did not have this capability. We forget this. I use Google Earth to find these points of reference after the fact. This represents an absent military presence. It also echoes previous references to mapping and borders evident in my previous work. Belfast streets were under heavy military occupation for more than 30 years. The Saracen tanks may have cleared out, but the technology of surveillance left behind is ever present. The coordinates also invite the viewer to step into my shoes and to imagine a picture of their own in this evolving space I once called home. The second photograph up here also combines an album photograph with a picture of mine. The small photograph is of my grandfather, William John Somerville, with my brother and me. The image that I made was made at the Thompson graving dock where the Titanic was built in the Belfast shipyards, but before it was cleaned up and repurposed as a major tourist site. Willie John Somerville was a lifer at the shipyards where he worked as a day labourer for a pittance. More often underemployed, he endured the daily humiliation of standing on the dock waiting to be picked by the foreman. Workers were divided into Protestants and Catholics and had to raise either a blue card or a red card, signifying their religious background. This is not unlike a scene I encountered in New Orleans after Katrina, where I witnessed undocumented workers hanging out around a gas station, waiting to be picked by farmers for a day's labor. When all the Protestant workers had been picked, my grandfather would often be the first Catholic on the list, since he actually had a Protestant name and was from a mixed religious background. So this work then offers a glimpse into how I use photography to form questions about memory, place, and to offer a critical view of what constitutes a nuanced and personal vision of Britishness, and to suggest a new approach to documenting the everyday. So there's a few more pictures in the series, and I'll just flash them by, and we can return to these pictures, and then that's it for me. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to come to speak. It's quite an honour to be up here and having heard so many eminent scholars talk about their different interests. So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So in this brief introduction, I will present a small selection of photographs that explore some of the pertinent themes and processes in my practice. All are taken from projects I've undertaken over the past decade, which attempt to record the English and British landscape during a period of economic, social, and political upheaval. This first photograph is titled Keynes Country Park Beach, Gloucestershire, 2008. So I was born in Croydon, South London, in the early 1970s. My mother is a northerner from a working-class, Labour-supporting community in Cumbria, who met my upper-middle-class father, London-raised father, when they were both working in the capital. My formative years were spent in Oxted, a well-heeled provincial town in Surrey's commuter belt, surrounded by Tupperware parties and Conservative Party summer fetes, beautifully illustrated by Martin yesterday. Family holidays were often spent walking in the Lake District, usually in the rain, or visiting relatives in Angmering-on-Sea, a retirement town on the flint pebble-lined beaches of the south coast. Whilst photography was part of my life from a young age, looking at books by the likes of Macmillan, Brandt, Tony Ray Jones, Anna Fox, attending art school or enlisting for a degree in photography was not deemed appropriate for the son of an IT consultant. So I ended up at the University of Sheffield studying human geography, a branch of geography that focuses on the systematic study of patterns and processes that shape human interaction with the landscape. These experiences, among others, have formed an important part of my consciousness of who I am and how I think about Britain. T.S. Eliot once wrote that the point of any journey is to find out where you come from. The urge to document one's homeland and inquire into our collective identity is a powerful one, which has occupied the efforts of writers and artists for centuries. Having returned from Russia in 2005, where I'd spent a year making work for my book Motherland, I was ready to develop some of the themes that I'd found there. Motherland was an exploration of, among other things, the Russians' attachment to their homeland. This attachment to place was somewhat mysterious, simultaneously profound and banal, and it led me to think about my own attachment to my homeland. My first series, where this photograph is taken from, was called We English. I can show you the book afterwards, which began as a development of my Russian work, springing from my fascination with ideas of belonging, memory, identity, and place. And We English would be another journey, not quite as epic as the one across Russia, but nonetheless involving a 1993 Talbot Swift motorhome, my pregnant wife Sarah, our 2-year-old daughter, and a 4x5-inch large format camera. I was well aware of the long and rich history of documentary surveys of British photographers, many of which were brought together in the 2000 Tate exhibition, How We Are Photographing Britain, which I saw before I went on my own journey. However, the comparative lack of contemporary studies over the previous decade was encouraging, suggesting as it did that my inquiry might be timely. Whereas Motherland had featured both landscape studies and portraiture, I decided that I wanted in my photographs in England to engage with the idea of the collective, of groups of people populating the landscape. I was looking to reference a prior landscape tradition that was centuries old and also quite English. Having returned to a country seemingly ensconced within debates surrounding devolution, I decided to photograph within the borders of England the one country in the Union which appeared to my mind to have the least sense of who it was. Photographing from elevated positions was also important, often from the roof of my motorhome, as it turned out. Height would be transformative to the photograph, enabling me to get a greater sense of people's interaction with the landscapes and the people depicted. As a result, the viewer is placed at a slight distance and elevation from the subject, so they are not part of the action but detached critical viewers. I should point out at this stage that I wasn't able to get my motorhome onto the beach, so here I'm actually stood on a small stepladder. Looking at leisure activities struck me as a thought-provoking way of exploring England's shifting cultural and national identity. They seem to say much more about who we are than, for instance, what we do in the workplace. Leisure activities can be aspirational, revealing as much about how we see ourselves as how others wish to see us. And landscape is an intrinsic part of these leisure experiences. It is a commodity. We consume it and utilize it and make it our own, even though we very rarely own it. As so much of the English countryside, the visual appearance of this area of the Cotswolds is part wilderness and part constructed landscape. The Keynes Country Park beach forms part of the Cotswold Water Park, created in the mid-2000s with the flooding of gravel excavation pits. Much of the gravel, which had been used for over 60 years for building projects in the region, once a place of work, it had now transformed into a contemporary landscape of leisure. And I'm particularly interested in the details, which I'm going to point out a couple here. The number of people wearing socks with their shorts. This couple here with 20 bags of Walker's crisps. I quite like the Mohican here. And my kind of punctum, I suppose, would be this guy here resting his hand on his belly. As such, it becomes evident that an apparently harmonious landscape is... Interestingly, at the time this photograph was taken, the park was mired in political scandal when a massive fraud was exposed, embarrassing the Cotswold Council's Tory leadership and leading to several resignations. As such, it becomes evident that an apparently harmonious landscape is rarely simply that. It can also be a place of conflict, with different groups of people contesting its ongoing usage, preservation and value. My second photograph is titled Gordon Brown, Rochdale, 28th of April 2010, and comes from my series The Election Project, where I was commissioned as the election artist by the British Parliament to create an official record of the 2010 general election. Traversing the length and breadth of the country during the official 24 days of electioneering, the photographs encompass entire scenes peopled by politicians and their campaign teams. Once again, my elevated position affords a view that is unfamiliar to the person on the ground. In particular, the eye-level close-up views of the press photographer and television cameras in the media scrum. My photographs encompass entire scenes. What might normally appear to be banal vistas are peopled by weary campaign travellers transformed into elaborate theatres, the landscapes providing the set for the detail of many nuanced interactions. In this photograph, I serendipitously captured Gordon Brown encountering Gillian Duffy in Rochdale. All the elements of a theatrical play are here in one scene. The grinning man in the red tie at the bottom of the photograph clearly finds the confrontation amusing. The security service officials are aware and alert. Brown's personal aides are looking out for potentially damaging intervention. Bored ex-offenders go about their business of clearing a bridleway. A media opportunity arranged for the Labour's leader's visit to the town. Meanwhile, centre stage Gordon Brown is harangued by Gillian Duffy, whom moments later he would describe as a bigoted woman. This actually became a huge political scandal as Gordon Brown was caught with his microphone on, calling her a bigot, and this turned into one of the most important events in the 2010 general election. After the election and the fall of New Labour, I began looking at different ways of representing the economic crisis and period of austerity unleashed by the coalition government of Cameron and Clegg. The 30th Olympiad was held on the 5th anniversary of the credit crunch against the backdrop of economic uncertainties, Eurozone turmoil, and predictions of a long, slow financial recovery. In many ways, it was a period reminiscent of the last Olympics held in London in 1948, which became known as the Austerity Games. London 2012, it was widely claimed, presented an opportunity for the British public, and indeed much of the rest of the world, to momentarily forget the economic gloom that surrounded us. As this photograph, equestrian-jumping individual, Greenwich Park, London, clearly illustrates, Britain staged a showcase of extraordinary human endeavour. delivering one of the largest post-war public works projects. London was transformed with events staged in locations such as Greenwich Park, presenting the capital in a telegenic light, an inspired marketing pitch from an economy desperate for growth. In the case of Greenwich, this landscape has a long history as a hilltop site for expansive views of London, which have been celebrated in prints, poetry and paintings, such as Turner's A View of London from Greenwich, 1809, a fact the organising committee of the Olympics must have been well aware. After an uncertain start, an attitude of national pride and sentimental patriotism pervaded the reportage, depicted perfectly in Frank Control Boyce and Danny Boyle's evocative opening ceremony. Having been granted special access to photograph the Olympics by the IOC, my photographs take in not just the sporting spectacle itself, but all its surrounding social, cultural and political vistas. My perspective is somewhat oblique to the usual sports photography we see. They explore the relationship between the public and the athletes, putting the events in the context of the built environment and the wider social issues thrown up by hosting such a thoroughly modern spectacle. The drama is not just about the equestrian rider crossing the finishing line, but the alternative narratives found, the assertion of national identities on view in the pastiche of British landscapes represented in the various horse jumps, the ordering of the crowds, the backdrop of the City of London and Canary Wharf, the financial hub of London, but also the significance of the camera hovering ominously over the scene, a reminder that this landscape is one big stage set. In conclusion, formal training in cultural geography has certainly influenced my work within photography. For instance, this photograph, Willie Lott's house at Flatford, East Bergholt, 2014, was taken as part of a collaboration with Stephen Daniels, Professor of Cultural Geography at the University of Nottingham. My photographs aim to explore our presence and intervention in the landscape through topographical observations. I see the landscape as something that should be read and decoded, revealing the values and meaning that are written into them. In each image, I hope to reveal forms of cultural character and identity, which upon closer inspection reveal a richness of detail and meaning. And I have to finish with this picture. I'm depressed to say. Finally, I'm delighted to say that my mother and father have forgiven me for taking up a career in photography and not human geography. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to just say I'm also delighted to be here. Creating a sandwich of Joe Spence using my mother and myself presented me with a new narrative. The stance now appears to be defiant. The tone becomes reminiscent of 80s graffiti, I Was Here. And the coincidental title, Colonization, maybe allows me an introduction of an uncomfortable truth without being explicit. Each image taken more than a decade apart, it feels to me like it could be Colonization Part 1, Part 2, and Colonization the Third. The images as a collective become one, celebrating and recognizing solidarity, commonality, and the intersections of race and class. Photographing my mother in front of the front door, I've realized during this process continues a tradition. It's a familiar featured backdrop in my family's photo albums. When relatives visited, first communions, birthdays. It's only while putting this presentation together that I realized that I never once saw any of our neighbors do the same, and we lived on the main road, the Hertford Road. I now wonder if my mother was doing this to make some kind of statement, showing what she was and had worked so hard for. The notion of an Englishman's castle is their home. The next two images, taken nearly a decade apart, show me and my mother in the back garden, in the same spot, before and after double glazing, and before the selfie, the camera on a tripod using the timer setting. My mother is moving because she doesn't understand how I can be sitting but taking the photo. She thinks that she has time to adjust. I'm laughing because I'm trying to explain and keep her seated. Injecting my mother and self into this presentation is an attempt to reconcile the absence of the black women who have been marginalised in British history over time. I see that image of my mother and I think instantly of flowers, marigolds, red tulips, roses, our cherry and apple tree, even spurs. However, it's also reminiscent of the words of the historian David Olusoga, who describes a time when Black British, in the minds of some, was an impossible duality. I asked friends if they could identify Britishness in these images. I circulated the images via WhatsApp. Nathan E. Richards comments that there appears to be a strong sense of belonging and pride. He also noted that the setting is definitely British. Look at the light. Etienne Joseph said it reminded him of his nans in Stratford. He could identify Britishness, but in a double consciousness type of way, a sense of there mixed with there, a sense of here mixed with there. Kelly Foster noted that the architecture had hints of the suburban dream, arts and crafts houses in London, achievable versions of the stately home, stained glass, net curtains, the influence of William Morris, symbols of home. Working with the Equiano Centre at UCL, the work of Dr. Gemma Romain and Caroline Bracey has been crucial to my career development. Their unique expertise, encouraging my independent learning, their work has had a life-changing impact. As a researcher for Career Black Spaces 1 and 2 and Spaces of Black Modernism at the Tate, 2014 to 2015, the papers of Barbara Kasima, Edward Burrow, and Ronald Moody exposed that these collections had been marginally explored, yet they demonstrated an interconnectedness between key interwar artists and performers associated with them. It has been hugely valuable to work alongside Bressy and Romain, exploring gaps and silences in historiography of interwar London and Europe. Their work has been crucial to being able to place myself or find place for myself within the archival profession, particularly their understanding of the Black Atlantic as a patchwork of spaces, places, and networks, which often leave fragmented impressions and biographies. With this image, I connect a timeline and geography uncovered during the Equiano Centre's project, Drawing Over the Colour Line, to present day, a kind of archival footsteps. The Drawing Over the Colour Line was a walking tour of Soho that focused on the ethnicity and sexuality of interwar Soho and uncovered thriving, ethnically diverse communities and evidence of the ongoing Black presence in the UK. This image was taken at a club called Sunday Happy Days just off Shaftesbury Avenue. Kelly Foster called this image polo shirts and biceps. Definitely urban, she said, in a literal sense. She asked herself and me why and how we knew these men looked British rather than African American, Cuban, or South African. We concluded and agreed that these group of men display the inheritance of a certain type of British culture that had now matured. Many respondents expressed that they could definitely see Britishness, however, they often had difficulty defining or unpicking what Britishness is. In conclusion, these images, but more importantly, this exercise has reinforced for me a sense of knowing I belong whether I like it or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Ego, and thank you all for answering the challenge and the discipline of the shortage of time. So clearly from what we've seen in these presentations is that for all of you, Britain functions as place, as locus of identity, as problem, in uneasy relationship to England, Ireland, and this colonial space outside, so that it functions not as a secure place, a readily occupiable space, or even a readily mapped define space, but in all these cases as a place of anxiety and uncertainty. I mean, even for Simon, did you begin with this question that the English don't know who they are, or that it's a territory that needs to be mapped. So could I invite you to talk a little bit more about that anxiety, uncertainty, a relation to a place that is not quite occupiable?
Well, for me, it's really a symptom. It's symptomatic of the immigrant experience, going away and coming back. And I grew up with my mother's sisters emigrated to America 3 times, and then they would come back. They would just land on the doorstep and say, "Oh, we didn't like it," but then they'd go away again. And then, but like, have they gone back? And so I had this image in my head about this, wonderland somewhere beyond what I was experiencing. And so when I was holding my sense of identity in place here, I also had this fantasy about what was there. And some of the anxiety that manifests itself only comes later. You sort of immigrate, you go away, and then I did that return thing. I returned every year for the first 15 years that I lived in the United States. I refused to become an American citizen. I came from a very anxious-ridden environment with boundaries and territories marked out psychologically as well as physically. So the anxiety was always for me an undercurrent, and it was an underpinning of anything. And I really couldn't find a way to express that visually. I didn't have the language that I wanted till much later on. So during the 70s, when I was living in Britain and photographing there, I'd return home, and someone mentioned the other day that you couldn't have a camera in Belfast during the Blitz. Well, that was also true of my neighbourhood in the 70s. So people asked me, I'd go back to Nottingham where I was a student, and people said, why aren't you photographing and documenting the Troubles? One, we didn't call it the Troubles in our neighbourhood. We saw it as outright war against us. We didn't say Troubles. And I'd go back and I'd say, well, if I walk around my neighbourhood with a camera, my local Republican friends will be very suspicious of why I'm there. If I go through the barriers and through the turnstiles into the centre of the town, it would be yanked off me by the military or so on. So I felt that I had lost that, so there's an anxiety around being a photographer in a place where you couldn't photograph early on, and then, but many anxieties have piled up since then.
So, Ego, too, you finished with the question about how to locate yourself in Britain and locate Britishness in your photographs.
I think it's combined with, when I hear you ask that, I think of my mum always keeping her Nigerian passport, and that sense that at any minute she could be chucked out of the country. So I find the whole Brexit thing quite interesting when that was an ongoing thing as I was growing up. But it's also there was a reality of the period of time growing up in the 80s in London where I think we can take for granted that even just the phrase Black British as a normal and a standard wasn't a reality. So I think and I expressed in the email to Martina and yourself, the idea of trying to present Britishness on this kind of platform became kind of problematic, uncomfortable, and gave me anxiety. That feeling of rejection is still there, even though I have always felt very comfortable in all these spaces, I also feel it's very much my city and very much my place and where I come from.
And what about the actual territory of photography then, which is another place? Can one find oneself in there? As Angela just said, the machine is forbidden, that space is forbidden. And in what sense then did you feel that photography was an occupiable space for you to deal with these issues?
Well, to be honest, going through these, particularly the photographs of my mum, I'm going to just speak because this is the process of the photography, you know, the story behind that. You know, my mum had mental health issues. So that was a way of me just coping on visiting her on a Saturday, you know, like, but only looking back and having to make a selection to sort of express Britishness has this sort of, it's been a whole journey just finding the photographs and putting them together and then having to look. So actually I'd say through this process, it has given me a kind of confidence as well to actually reflect back on things that I didn't place value on.
I mean, I suppose for me, the anxiety was how the work began, because I mean, I came from quite a safe, cocooned background, you know, in Surrey. So, you know, differing to you two, I needed to kind of go away to really kind of get a sense of what else was going on, if you like. And I think I was so shocked by these sudden, or what seemed sudden debates about devolution, particularly in Scotland, that it really kind of forced a sense of, well, I know there is this tradition of photographers going out to explore this sense of identity. So now it kind of seemed like an interesting time for me to almost follow in that lineage to try and do something similar. But what was interesting was that I decided that I didn't want to do it on my own. So actually, the part of the reason it's called We English was because I set up a blog where anybody could invite me to come and photograph something. So the idea is that I wanted to engage directly with the audience who I was going out to photograph. And actually, most of the things that were suggested to me were very pastoral. So immediately it gave you that sense that people had a certain idea of what England was, rather than necessarily a reality. So actually the book, although it's about leisure, there's no shopping there, because even though shopping is probably the major leisure activity in Britain or in England, actually nobody suggested that idea. And I was kind of quite interested in responding to those things that people really thought about. And actually a lot of ideas were posted by expats. And it was often about the idea of memory, and of course, you know, the whole idea of, was it Benedict Anderson's imagined geography, or imagined communities, you know, a certain kind of sense of how they remembered, or how they think they remembered their country. And so that was kind of what I was exploring. But I think what was interesting was only after I'd made this project, that in 2009, where we suddenly realised that actually Northern Rock, the British bank, collapsed in early 2007, and Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. So actually, during the whole time that I was making this book, there was this kind of undercurrent, this almost upheaval of the economic grounding of the country, but nobody saw it coming. So actually, the idea of anxiety started was almost being teased out over that period of time, and that's something I suppose that I've been trying to kind of tackle in the work since then. And actually what I'm doing now is going back and re-looking at all the photographs I took during this period that didn't make this, to see if I can find a sense of that anxiety represented in the photographs.
Yeah, and sort of to follow on from that too, in relation to anxiety, when I returned to Belfast after the Good Friday Accord, I was very sceptical. I was very kind of hopeful but sceptical. So I created this performance of myself. I hadn't done that much documentary photography for quite a while. I'd been working with different strategies. So I invented myself as a photographer. So I saw myself as in the role of a photographer who would go out on the street. And that's how, and I performed it. So my whole project was a performance. I walked along the street trying to be objective when I knew I couldn't be. I walked along the peace line along the side of the place where I've really never had been. I engaged a little bit with some of the community members, and they were pretty like, what are you doing here? What do you want to do? Why are you doing this? And this was all during this time when we were supposed to be sort of, you know, singing Kumbaya or something, I don't know. But the sort of anxiety for me also came back when you asked me to put together this presentation, and I started looking at this photograph with the little hut with the flag flowing, and it really made me think about how it represented, and I hadn't thought about this before, the sort of the collapse of this idea of Britishness, because here you have this ramshackle little hut with plastic over the top that is temporal, you know, and it has no permanency. But the flag is flying anyway, and the tower is burning, and there's just you know, there's just this sense of what's next around the next corner, you know.
From another point of view, one other thing that you all share is that you all trained in Britain. So I wonder to what extent specifically British debates, networks, institutions and agendas, do you feel that they shaped your practice? That and it's another sense in which you might think of its distinct relation to Britain. And I'm thinking especially of educational institutions, obviously. It's been important for you.
I studied design at Goldsmiths, and once I finished, I swore that I would never go back into that institution. However, I've been very fortunate to spend the last 2 years there within the Women's Art Library, and it's been and particularly off the back of being at UCL, and it was just before that period of time where Nathan Eds was asking about why is my professor black, all those kind of dialogues, the eugenics conversation. And to be quite honest, within UCL, I could really feel it. You can feel it as you walk through that kind of colonial kind of space, and it wasn't really being addressed. And particularly having grown up, being born in the UK, I was quite interested and intrigued how archival education is actually taught, and where the perspective is coming from. And I spent 4 years doing it part-time, and it just didn't feel like it was including me. So continuing to challenge that within the UK is really important. But I'd also like to give a lot of credit to Althea Greenan at the Women's Art Library for creating space for a group of female artists. And we just sort of plotted there, and it's a very powerful thing to be able to navigate an archive on your own terms and just go out and pull things up from the repository, not ask people. Mm-hmm. And so that element of trust and a way of working collectively and resources, I think it's almost like I had a second degree, being able to go back and just play around. You know, we've done plays from a collection. You know, we were working around the Joe Spence archive, and that really shaped a lot of what I've been doing as well.
I mean, I actually have no formal training in photography, so you know, I'm kind of self-taught. But there's no doubt that you know, as I mentioned before, that in terms of my relationship to geography, and I think what was interesting was that cultural geography specifically was a real area growing in the 90s, and particularly the link between geography and photography. So a number of professors, particularly at Nottingham University, people like Peter Jackson, Stephen Daniels, David Matlas, were all kind of looking at Doreen Massey, we're all looking at the relationship between visual culture, photography, art, and geography. And so there was this kind of melding of these different disciplines, which I suppose is kind of something that I'm now kind of going back to. I mean, it wasn't something I was necessarily interested in at the time, but certainly I'm trying to engage with more as I develop my practice, and have actually got links now with Nottingham University. So I think in that sense, I think if we talk about education now, I actually think the British education system's in a bit of crisis. You know, there's every other university has a photography degree. I mean, there's just too many people being taught photography, and not enough good people training them, and it is about bums on seats. And I think it's having a detrimental effect on the standard of practitioners that are coming out, and I think that's something that certainly needs to be addressed if British photography, not Britishness and photography, is going to move forward.
Of course, I was at the other end of things. I was at the start, first creative photography program in the UK, taught by Paul Hill and Thomas Cooper, John Mulvaney from Chicago. And there was a sort of an energy and an excitement, and there was a move towards recognizing that photography could be something other than simply evidencing. And there was also a kind of dialogue that seemed to be sometimes not that useful around documentary versus, you know, fine art, and those were sort of emerging sort of dialogues that were going on that would come into play. But there was a sort of energy and an excitement in that place. The students were really left up to their own to themselves to do what they wanted to do, and we worked hard and made work, and then when the time came to go to grad school, there was only one grad school in the entire country that had a graduate program. They took 3 students, so it was a very different place. It really wasn't academicized at all, but there was a lot. I found myself just sort of gravitating more to the community-based projects that were beginning to sort of filter up, if you like, from various communities, women's communities, feminist communities, and sort of engaging across disciplines with people from all different areas. So I sort of was just basically your typical activist, feminist during that time. I would just organize things, and it was so easy to organize anything. I remember calling up Laura Mulvey on the phone, who didn't know me at all, and said, "Hey Laura, could you send me up some movies from London? I'm doing a women's conference next week." And then all of a sudden these original films came, 16mm films came up from Laura Mulvey in London, and I'd said to my chair in my department, "Hey, we need to really have some books that really deal with visual culture." And so he says, "Well, just order something." So I bought out the London bookstore that sold. There was like vans coming around, and I was teaching at a community college, and the van would be coming around every 2 days, unloading books for our conference. And, so there was a very energizing time. And then, of course, I met you then at some point in Nottingham, in a living room where John was reading a paper, a very unusual thing to do back then. And he was given a paper in documentary photography in someone's living room, and we're all sitting there going, "God, he's reading a paper." What is that? We had never heard anybody do that before. It was brilliant, though. So it was a very energizing time, and a lot of great people, doing good stuff.
I think this is important because any individual practice always emerges from a set of enabling questions, networks, institutions, or perhaps disabling institutions, so that it emerges in reaction. Now, as you can guess, I'm just getting into my questions, but the audience has been very patient, so I do want to open it up now to your questions too. There's one right in the middle there, right in the center.
Some of you touched on this about sort of the confusion about whether I'm British or not British, and for Americans it gets kind of confusing. Who actually considers themselves British? Who are British people? Because if you ask someone from Scotland, technically they're British. But would they say they're British, or they'd scoff at you and bop you on the head? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, my community, the only people who would say they were British would be staunch Ulster Protestants who align themselves with the crown, and they're trying to hang on to the last vestiges of that. But the only people I've ever heard talking about British are the English. The rest of us are Irish, Welsh, or Scottish. So the Act of the Union was in 1801, but so I don't know.
And I'd like to say I'm not confused. I'm British. It's other people's perceptions, and it's how other people choose. And I've just immigrated, so I live in Minneapolis. So it's been a real trip and also I have a name, Ego Ahaiwe, and it's identity. And how other people feel and understand what British is. That's what I find. It's not my idea. That's what I mean. It's never been, I know who I am and where I've come from. It's other people's perceptions that I've had to reconcile and negotiate.
My alignment changes every 2 years. So when it's the World Cup, I'm English. And when it's the Olympics, I'm British.
So, even though you're from England, you don't always consider yourself British. It's kind of...
Well, I think, so often the terms just get into use, by the English. We just, as you heard in my talk, sometimes I say English and I meant British, or vice versa. Right? I think it's become more important as we see what happens politically over the next few years, and God knows what's going to happen. There are so many kind of things that could unravel in terms of Brexit, and I think at that point the issue will be forced in terms of, it might only be England left, so it might not be Britain.
But you're also talking about a highly mobile and slippery signifier, British, but we all carry British passports, which used to say we were British subjects, not British citizens. Something happened recently. So the question of spaces of identity and civic identity and the question of the state. But one could say it's the very mobility and cloudedness of it that has enabled the British ruling class to negotiate all the conflicts in order to successfully run what is actually an atavistic state form, without ever modernizing. More questions, lots at the back.
To follow up on what Simon just said, my question is about that B word. Other than Britishness, it's Brexit. You were all talking about anxieties that play into your work and questions of sight and education and identity and networks. And I'm wondering what this recent change that we still don't know what the outcomes will be, if that plays into your work and all of your projects in any way. Are you starting to considering it now, or is it something that you'll have to wait and see how does that take shape?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm fired up. Like Martin was saying, now's the time to be making work. I mean, the reason I've been making work in Britain the last 10 years is because I felt there was so much happening. The collapse of New Labour, the emergence of the coalition, economic, all of these things. And so for me, Brexit is just the start of something else. And I think what was most surprising to so many people was actually how divided we are. And actually, George Orwell talks about this dysfunctional family. I think it's kind of way past that, because, I'm from Brighton. We are all Remainers. But I was, when I looked at the map of how people voted, I was an island in the amongst of Leave, which, completely shocked me. And I think, suddenly it is dividing communities. We're seeing already some effects in terms of racism and, the whole idea of, the kind of closing of borders. I mean, God knows what's going to happen with the Irish border. So I think there's so many unknown unknowns. Who was that?
But Angela, you came from an already divided,
Right,
if
so-
there is any undivided territory there.
Yeah, I mean, really, the most recent work I've been working on is actually on the other side of the border in the Republic of Ireland, and it's I've always felt welcome there. I've always felt, that is an identity that I haven't fully explored, so I'm exploring that more now through invisible traces of the 19th century famine. I'm making work in those territories, which actually plays back to the reason why we had the famine. People think it was the failure of the crops. It wasn't. It was for the export of all the wonderful crops that were sent to Southampton so they could be shipped to the colonies. So Irish food was grown and taken from under them, put on the ships under armed guards, sent to the colonies in India, and the Irish were left to starve. So I'm sort of trying to negotiate that, but I'm back in the 19th century, but with a contemporary slant. So I'm trying to and so that's preoccupying me. How that will impact Brexit will impact Northern Ireland. It'll be very interesting because Northern Ireland actually voted to remain. And so all of us have this fantasy then, well, if you want to remain, just hop back over across the border, you've got a welcome, So I don't know, I think it's all going to be very complicated.
And
I have
a
no
lot of
answer.
your current projects are very archival, which are crucial to these spaces of identity.
But in relation to this, after Brexit, I asked friends, because I'm not there, friends started to say that they noticed the St. George's flag a lot more, and flags everywhere. So I've just asked friends to send me pictures. When you see flags, send all these different kinds of settings. But also I chose this particular work because grew up in Edmonton, kind of suburban. It hasn't changed very much, even when I go back now. And I think of the park, there's a whole, but I chose this work because when I think of Martin Parr and body of work, The Last Resorts, and those images of kids, I see myself at the park. I see myself as those kids, and all doing ice cream, those visits to the seaside, that kind of Britishness that I didn't question when I was growing up, really, no matter what the experiences I was receiving. But also, I chose this book because I think of my neighbours. We lived on the main road of, Italian on one side, English along the side, and so I chose this book because when Brexit happened, I just thought, well, what does that say as neighbours to each other? That's what I think of Brexit. It's like, what does, and friends that I've spoken to, it's like how there was a lot of talk of people not being able to really look each other in the face the next day. And that I find really compelling.
Can I just bring up one point, which may be a slight elephant in the room, but I think it's important to bring this up in relation to photography and Britishness, or particularly Britain, is that we've all travelled to America for a conference about photography and Britishness to visit this wonderful institution that doesn't currently collect a great deal of photography. And in Britain, we are seeing a complete collapse of institutions supporting photography. And actually, this is a critical time. If we're going to be continuing in 20, 30 years of time to kind of meet and talk about photography, that unless something happens in terms of how British institutions think about photography, then it's going to be a very poor future. I mean, we've got Birmingham Library that's just closed, which holds Sir Benjamin Stone's archive. We've got the National Media Museum, which is just shuttered shop pretty much, which holds Tony Raine-Jones's work and his diaries, which I spent a long time looking at when I was doing We English. And then the RPS collection moving to the V&A with no additional staff or funding. It's actually becoming extremely difficult to get access to a lot of this work. And I think this is something that particularly, people leaving here, scholars that are interested in photography and Britishness and that need to think about and that we all need to kind of consider. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about what Ego's doing is that actually she's going back to the idea of the archive and not just these kind of big archives, but actually thinking about the kind of communal work, and I think that's really important. In terms of where we move forward.
I'd like to take just one more question, but you may have to accept a yes, no, maybe answer.
Sorry, I'll just make it specifically for Ego here. I was really struck by the ways your work deals with interiority and exteriority, and just in the way, you have these images of you and your mother outside. And I was thinking about a longer, perhaps, genealogy of Black photography, both in the US and in Britain, around the front room. So I just wondered whether that was an influence or that was a history that you were also engaging with.
No, I didn't. It's only sort of after the fact, because now I'm aware of that work, but it's only now I can see that kind of connection, and maybe what I was trying, there's definitely the archivist in me was working before I knew I was an archivist. So one of the images that I didn't include was an image of my mum in the front room, just on the phone. No one's on the other end, but dressed in traditional sort of, Igbo, her wrapper and everything. Just get her to dress up for me and do something kind of thing. But there was something about capturing that environment. And I've got to say, this exposes the poverty as well, because as beautiful as the light is, before the double glazing, those images show deterioration,
Well, talking about archivists, I think there may be some waiting for us. So I'd like to thank our speakers for reading the comments very much.